In 1972, I was 16, and I did not know that a bizarre character, the Austrian artist Friedensreich unter Wasser, was wandering the streets of my city, Milano, preaching a new architecture while holding a tree in his hands, an architecture based on the presence of trees in houses, courtyards, and rooms, an organic architecture which promotes the idea of a fixed ratio between the number of human beings and the number of trees in any living space. At the time, I was a high school student involved in the formation of the extra-parliamentary left movement, walking and protesting more or less in the same streets in Milano without worrying about issues such as ecology or environmental sustainability, but rather to greet social problems of unemployment, social inequalities, the right to education. I considered the ecology and the environment as superstructural and irrelevant issues, typical of the capitalist bourgeoisie. In the same years in Italy, in Florence, some young architects and artists in their 20s and 30s engaging in politics. The groups had begun to think about the relationship between trees and people in cities and to build extreme and radical visions of the urban future. Images of urban places permeated by forest and forest penetrated by architecture. But even such a strong, radical, and disturbing vision fell in the indifference of the dominant culture in the Italian and European intellectual left. And I never would imagine it 40 years later to find myself in Italy, and exactly in Milano, following the construction site of an architecture that today seriously aims to revolutionize the relationship between trees and human beings within an urban center. Well, the idea of building a tower completely surrounded by trees came to me in 2007 while I was in Dubai, one of the cradles of the new financial and oil capitalism. As director of the Domus magazine, I was reporting on the busy construction of a city in the desert, made up of tens of new towers and skyscrapers. All were coated with glass or ceramic or metal. All were reflexive of the sunlight and therefore heat generator in the air and, above all, on the ground inhabited mainly by pedestrians. Moreover, in those years I was teaching, and the school magazine had published a research by Alejandro Zairapolo, which confirmed that 94% of the world's tall buildings built after the year 2000 were covered in glass. Glass and mineral skins in an increasingly artificial and mineral city. In those months of 2007, I was starting the project of the tower in the center of Milan, and suddenly, interesting and bizarre ideas often come suddenly, unexpectedly, and sharply. It occurred to me to design, as a reaction to the prevailing trend, two biological towers, two towers covered not of glass, but of leaves. Leaves of plants, leaves of shrubs, but especially leaves of trees. Two towers covered with life. To convince my clients, the Italian branch of an American real estate multinational, it was extremely helpful. An international newspaper published a picture of the Green Tower with a compelling headline, "In Milano, True Sustainable Architecture." In fact, the promise of these two buildings, 90 and 120 meters high, was to greatly reduce energy consumption by filtering the sunlight through a facade of leaves and, thanks to the microclimate that it created on the balconies, which helps reduce by about 3 degrees the temperature between the inside and the outside of the apartment. The message was well received and fortunately convinced my clients to follow my advice. I added the leaves of the trees would absorb, beside carbon dioxide, the fine dust produced by urban traffic, and so they would clean the air of Milano, in addition to producing oxygen themselves. In the following months, together with the architects of my office, we wrote a vertical forest manifesto, emphasizing the idea of architecture and sustainable living, which would help to reduce fuel consumption and, therefore, the human impact on the environment. The truly revolutionary aspect of the project was obviously not the presence of plants and shrubs on the balconies, but the idea of hosting nearly 800 tall trees from 3 to 9 meters high, along with 1,700 meters of vase plots that surround the balconies of the two towers. The proposal was to have 2 trees for every inhabitant of the 2 towers, a total of 21,000 plants, 4,000 shrubs, and 50,000 climbing plants and perennials. The idea was really the one of the house for trees, which also housed the human. Just this week, maybe the video can start. Just this week, the first example of a vertical forest, the 2 towers under construction in Milano, is about to be completed. And this video shows the last 7-meter-old trees lifted and planted at the 28th floor of the tower. It took years and research and experiments conducted with a group of outstanding experts in botany, ecology, and sustainability to solve problems that architecture had never addressed. How to avoid that a tree at a height of 100 meters could fall, broken by the wind, for instance. How to ensure a continuous and proper irrigation to trees planted at different heights, humidity condition, and sunlight exposure. How to prevent that the life of the trees could be jeopardized, transfigured by the personal choice and, let me say, the sudden decision of the private owners of the apartment. Well, now that these problems are more or less solved, but the 2 towers of the vertical forest host their plant population while waiting for the human population, I realized that the real challenge that we face has little to do with the yet important issue of sustainability. The real issue that the vertical forest faces is rather that of biodiversity. 20,000 plants belonging to more than 100 different plant species means to engage the equivalent of 2 hectares forest on a plot of land of 1,500 square meters in the center, in the real center of a big city. A living ecosystem that is already beginning to attract insects and birds and is already home to numerous nests, giving hospitality at different levels to population of birds that had left the skies of Milano. An ecosystem that some biologists are monitoring and using as a living laboratory. For example, to test the ability of a population of useful insects to fight, without the use of pesticide, harmful insects to plant life. This is an amazing opera by Charles Ray, the American artist. I often wonder why it's so hard to raise awareness in European policy on biodiversity and on the extinction of hundreds of species of flora and fauna. And conversely, I wonder what is so fascinating the rhetoric of sustainability, which continues to attract the attention of politics, culture, and the business world. Well, I think that the truth is that if today we look at the world from the perspective of sustainability. We do it standing on the firm pedestal of the dominant species, careful paying attention not to lose its control over the world and over the other species. If we accept the perspective of biodiversity, and we do it all the way, we are forced to develop a non-anthropocentric ethic of the planet, the territories, and the city we inhabit. We are forced to think about our human species as one of many living species, and to imagine that there may, in fact, there should be places on this planet where we simply do not have, and we should not be at the center. To think about the world from the perspective of the sustainability, that's another opera by Beniamino Servino, an Italian artist. To think about the world from the perspective of sustainability is concerned about reducing our footprint on the planet while firmly remaining well in the center of it. To think of it from the perspective of biodiversity means to think about it the way the radical ecological thinking has started to do as one of the presences of the planet. That's an amazing video of Robert Wainaza, who is showing what is happening in the skies of Europe, or basically around London, in a summer day, cycle of a day. Well, this kind of images are convincing us that if we observe Europe within the perspective of biodiversity, we have to take in account that today Europe is a unique, huge city. Europe is a huge polycentric city, populated by thousands of small and medium-sized cities. A single city that today, from Porto to Tirana, from Palermo to Oslo, we cross in a single day, and that it's seen as a unique community of life by an increasing number of women and men. Think about the 2 million Erasmus alumni, but also of the second and third generation immigrants who have kinship, affective and professional network distributed in different places of the Europe city. Thinking of Europe as a big city also means to take note of the incredible extent of this city, that in recent decades has covered as a continuum of texture, coast, valleys, plains, devouring thousands of acres of nature and agriculture. A single continuous city that has now surrounded a few large natural areas, turning them into parks, and agricultural areas converting them into gardens. The continuous city that today occupies 80% of the European territory has altered the biological balances and has greatly reduced the biodiversity of species. On the one hand, by accelerating the reduction and extinction of some plants and animal species, and on the other, by forcing them to invade foreign territories that were forcibly removed to the wilderness. The deers that are forced to move in the center of Bolzano, the foxes on the London underground, the wild boars that inhabit the suburbs of Florence are clues to a deep unease in the spheres of life. A discomfort that we cannot think to face by seeking shelter into the past and portraying our cities within the confines of another epoch. The great challenge of biodiversity must be thought within the condition of the continuous city that has today become Europe. It must be thought by creating protected areas entrusted to the radical autonomy of nature, from which totally expel not only the presence, but also the aspiration of government and control by our species. It must be thought by planning an agriculture that in large landlocked gardens of Europe's city regains a variety of crops and products, and is not just an extension of grey field planted with monoculture of cereals and inhabited by otters and crows. The great challenge of biodiversity must be fought by multiplying generative spots of plant and wildlife biodiversity within the most dense and congested urban areas, demineralizing urban surfaces, introducing injection of biodiversity. In 1982, the German artist Joseph Beuys built a triangle formed by 7,000 basalt stones in front of the Museum of Frederick II in Kassel. Each of these stones was intended to plant a tree. Whoever, by paying a sum of money, could adopt one of those 1,000 stones, and the money raised would serve to plant an oak tree. So, gradually, the pile of stone was shrinking until it disappeared, and 7,000 new oaks, each one with one of those basalt stones at its base, appeared in the area surrounding the city of Kassel. As Friedrich Hundertwasser, Joseph Beuys was shown as the great challenge of the coming decades, to adopt the place and building for our lives, and for each of them, realize injection of plants and wildlife biodiversity. Transforming the rocks in trees means to transform the houses and streets in places inhabited by thousands of species. It means learning to live with the trees, with their presence, and their rates of growth, and their uncanny ability to generate life and to host, even in the most polluted and congested cities in the world, the wealth of the living species. Thank you so much.